what makes humans different from other animals? Well, the answer is obvious. Our brains. Now, how did this happen? Well, generally accepted is evolution. We evolved to have larger brains and to be how we are. And now the big question, why did this happen? And that's what I want to talk a little bit about in this video today. When we're looking at biology, we usually look at it in the light of evolution and natural selection. So what that means is our theory is that brains evolved. We're using evidence and logic to kind of form that theory. And how natural selection works is you have a random chance event, generally, so a mutation. Then that mutation, if it gives the organism a higher chance of survival, or really just a higher chance of passing down its genes, because we'll also talk a little bit about sexual selection, which is a bit different. It's kind of related, a bit different. If that organism then has a higher chance of passing down genes, that mutation or trait gets passed on. What that means is that our brains had to have a benefit for humans back in the day. So while it seems obvious that brains are beneficial now, we have to think about past humans. And when we do that, we come up with some issues. One of the books I was reading on this topic was Sapiens. They have a whole section on the cognitive revolution. And I also read a book called The Red Queen by Matt Ridley. Both of those are kind of what I'm going to be referencing throughout this. So Sapiens basically talks about that brains take up a ton of energy, which means that we need to eat more and our muscles atrophy. So when you think about that, well, that's not so helpful. Back then, when there wasn't crazy technology and the brains of our ancestors weren't producing, let's say, firearms and things, well, why would they want smaller muscles? Why would they want to have to eat more? What's the benefit there? And when we're looking at natural selection, there always has to be some sort of an immediate benefit or a pressure pushing that trait downward, essentially. So then the question arises, essentially, what is that pressure? And I got all my points written down, so that's why I'm peeking down every once in a while. There's a couple theories that I saw, which I think make sense. I think make the most sense, rather. These are mainly just what I've saw. There could be other things that I happen to miss out there. The first was from the Smithsonian, and on their website, they discuss that brains evolve very slowly. Brain size increased very slowly. Then they evolved a bit faster, and then they evolved really fast during a period that happened to coincide with extreme shifts in climate. And the theory there basically was that bigger brains allowed us to adapt better to other climates. And this is pretty obvious how we would have adapted, which is, well, a bigger brain would have allowed us to problem solve in terms of finding food and finding shelter and things like that. So the first kind of theory would be that brains allow us to deal with challenges. Okay, makes sense, very natural selection-y. Bigger brain, better at dealing with challenges, more chance of survival, pass down genes. Okay, we're good there. The second theory is an idea which is sexual selection, and this is what was presented by Matt Ridley in The Red Queen. And the essential idea is that bigger brains possibly, because it's still kind of a little irrational what the immediate benefit of a bigger brain would be when it takes more energy. And now we need to eat more to support it, and etc. What Matt Ridley suggests is that it's sexual selection, not kind of traditional natural selection, that is providing the pressure for a bigger brain. And the reason for that could be that because we're social creatures, we socialize, and our brains play a role in that, essentially. Because of that, our brains originally, or did allow us to outwit and outcompete other members of the same sex for better mates. And what that basically meant is bigger brain meant, or he also said maybe seduce. So bigger brain meant you were more seductive, bigger brain meant you were more seductive, or you basically were just able to outcompete the other humans. One of the quotes he presents as part of this book is man's greatest rival is man, or it's mankind's greatest rival is mankind, but I thought that was kind of interesting. And the whole idea there is that we often think of selection as between species, but sometimes it's actually just within the species, because what we need to remember is that it's always about passing down the genes. So it's possible that brains actually did not help us so much with fighting other species in the early days because we hadn't developed technology, etc. yet. So instead of brains helping us develop to fight other species in those early days, maybe brains actually just helped us pass down our genes in terms of fighting for mates. So kind of interesting. And he basically just says men fighting men for women and women fighting women for men for the best mates. So those are kind of the two basic ideas. You've got challenge and you've got the idea of just kind of sexual selection. Challenge, brains help us overcome challenges. Sexual selection, brains help us get the best mates, therefore pass down our genes. When pass down your genes comes into play, all that means is that then the future generation has the genes that has bigger brains. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about, the two final things were enabling factors. So one big enabling factor, which is talked about in the book Sapiens, is that we had developed fire, and that was not done by Homo sapiens. That was done by, I think it was Homo erectus, not 100% sure on that, but it was done many generations before us. So fire basically meant that cooked food is easier to eat and it's easier to get nutrients from and digest. So it meant that one of the ways he put it is whereas a monkey has to spend hours and hours and hours chewing raw food, we're able to do the same in an hour because we're able to cook it, make it softer, easier to digest. This allowed us to have changes in our body which enabled a larger brain. So firstly, we could get nutrients better and we could eat more foods because you know this yourself. For example, a raw potato. You don't eat a raw potato, but you can eat a cooked potato. So it allowed us to eat more foods. And it also allowed us, because the nutrients were easier to digest, to shorten our intestines. And intestines apparently take quite a bit of energy. So if you shorten your intestines, that leaves more energy for other things, such as brains. And brains are massive consumers of energy when resting, which is a bit different from other tissue, right? Muscle, large consumer of energy when moving, but the brains are, actually muscle's also a large consumer of energy, so kind of a bad example, but brains are a massive consumer energy when we're just resting. I think it's like 43% resting energy, some huge number like that. And just when you think about how big we are as well. And then the final thing, the final thing I wanted to talk about was, I was thinking about this idea of like pseudo-evolution with our brains. And when I was thinking about this, I hadn't read enough. And then like 20 pages later, the book Sapiens talked about the exact same thing. And I thought I was so smart. And then I was like, oh, just an idea somebody else has already had, which is all right, right? At least you're kind of thinking about things. But this idea is basically that brains are so cool because when we think about the evolution of humans after the cognitive revolution, we can kind of think about it as there being two forms of evolution. Just normal evolution, so the evolution of our instincts and our bodies, which hasn't actually changed that much, although there has definitely still been evolution for humans. But what's really cool is you also have to think about evolution of your mental abilities. Not mental abilities. You also have to think about the mental evolution, and particularly the evolution of knowledge and especially because we're able to pass down knowledge through language. So the idea here would be that even though we haven't evolved much natural selection-wise, we have evolved a lot knowledge-wise, and technology allows us to kind of accelerate our growth in really interesting ways. And you know this intuitively, it just has such a major impact. One of the examples that how I would think about it is, imagine a human going into a cold climate versus a monkey. A monkey going into a cold climate would try, and eventually a couple monkeys with, let's say, a bit more fur might survive, and they might pass down their genes. And then slowly, the monkey will develop a new monkey that has thicker fur, maybe more fat deposits to help with more brown fat in particular, things like that. So monkeys, they slowly make it in, but it's very slow, and they have to develop physical traits. For humans, what do? Well, we kill a bear and we wear its fur. It's kind of I like to think of it as like pseudo-evolution. Instead of evolving ourselves, we kind of fake evolve by just using something else. Or let's say fire. We just develop fire, which we did. And then fire warms us. So kind of just an interesting idea in there.